Hello, I'm Dave Feinleib, and this is Beyond the Shelf. This show is an open exploration of the people and process behind e-commerce. Through conversations with innovators in the space, we learn the stories of these leaders and their strategies for e-commerce success. You can join our mailing list and find out more about how to build content at scale at itsrapid.ai. My guest on today's show is Bryan Gildenberg, one of the well-known CPG guys and founder of Confluencer Commerce. Bryan joined the CPG guys and started Confluencer Commerce after a career as SVP of Commerce at Omnicom and Chief Knowledge Officer at Kantar Retail. Bryan has a deep understanding of e-commerce and retail media and a gift for sharing unique insights that shed new light on business and retail strategy. Please enjoy my conversation with Bryan Gildenberg. Bryan, great to see you.
Dave, great to see you too. How you doing today?
Doing great. Long time no see.
Yes, indeed, it has. Well, certainly in person. We've seen each other this way a number of times. But I don't remember. I think the last time I saw you was about a year ago when I was out here. So
yeah.
So
now you got a nice sunny background. Where do we find you today?
Well, when I said out here, I'm in California again. Because the last time I saw you was in NorCal. It was almost literally a year ago. Because a friend of mine just texted me and reminded me that the day after I saw you, I went to the World Dog Surfing Championships in Pacifica.
That's right.
So and
I remember that.
That is this weekend. So if you're free and in the neighborhood, I cannot strongly enough recommend the World Dog Surfing Championships in Pacifica. So
that's great.
So
well, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, and I wanted to start with the story of you, if you're good with that. And I'd love it if you would take us back a bit to where you started in the industry, and we can go from there.
I was gonna say, dude, I'm in my mid-50s. You don't want the whole freaking story.
But still an interesting story.
Well, yeah, for sure. So I got my start in this industry 25 years ago, or 26, I guess. So my pre-business school career was in the nonprofit industry. So that's a whole different topic of exploring the vagaries of being the HR director at a museum. Which is what I did before business school, which is a great bar bet you can win, by the way. If you ever want to ask people what my job used to be, the HR director at the Boston Children's Museum is not going to come up. But that was what I did. Shifted gears coming out of business school and got into this industry by accident through a guy I went to business school with who had started working for a business called MBI at the time, run by a guy named Dan O'Connor, who many of the listeners will know, who is still studying retail around the world. But Dan, that was basically the origin story of what turned into Kantar on the retail side. So MBI at the time I joined it was a very small business that basically studied Walmart and helped brands understand how Walmart was going to change their world. So because this is the late 90s, right? So there were still meetings we went to at food companies in 1997 where people were saying things like, Walmart will never be able to sell food without high-low promotional strategies. Nobody buys food that way. These were real meetings that happened with real companies as late as the late 90s. By then, it was becoming apparent that Walmart was going to change the entire consumer products industry, to some degree already had, and was undertaking that transformation. It's also 1997 that Jeff Bezos wrote his first letter to shareholders for Amazon. And so it's been interesting for me over the years I've often told people that there are times in the narrative around Amazon where you can just go on the internet, go back to like 1994, find a document about Walmart, global search and replace Walmart with Amazon, you'll get exactly the same narrative around it. Can't be done this way. It has to be this way. Shoppers won't respond to this, et cetera, so on and so forth. It's a lot of the same narrative. So one of the virtues of being old is that great, I think it's Arthur Schlesinger, the great Arthur Schlesinger quote, that history doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Being able to find the rhymes in history, I think is really interesting. So when I started, I was basically at Kantar for, in one way, shape, or form for 23 years. Most of that time leading Kantar's global retail research practice in some way, shape, or form. And spent a couple of years at Omnicom after that, helping their commerce marketing agencies, which the artists formerly known as shopper marketing agencies, transform in a world where retail media sort of changing the game a little bit. And then about a year ago, as I was literally the weekend I saw you, sort of set out on my own. And today I do a variety of things, including host the CPG Guys podcast. So you can see my shirt. Run a thought leadership and consulting enterprise called Confluencer Commerce, which is really just me and the brand and the logo that my 14-year-old daughter designed. And then I'm the managing director for North America for a global retail information network called Retail Cities. So that's my world at the moment. So and that's the journey.
That is a great journey. I want to touch on this idea that you hear this can't be done. It shouldn't be done that way.
Yeah.
Though they won't be able to make it work. And we do hear that over and over with new approaches, technologies, things like that. Talk more about that, if you would. Why does that happen when we see that in many cases it does work?
Well, in many cases it does. In some cases it doesn't, and that's I think
Yeah.
the trick is splicing the gene on which is which, right? So, like for all the Amazons that come along, there are any number of pets.coms or 75,000 moronic Q-commerce businesses that have no viable economic model to whatever it is, right? I mean, there have been a series of things that have blown up that don't make sense. The way I always try to look at this, and I actually learned this from Amazon, staring at it and realizing, because it took me probably a year longer than it should have to realize Amazon was going to work. And I was one of those people saying, well, they're never going to be able to build the operating model to get the economics of this to work. And that was just wrong, because what I know about how to build a e-commerce operating model could fill a very short book. So I was repeating back things I had been told by people that did not know better, because they were important and influential, and I respected their perspective. One of the things you can always catch yourself on in this world is, am I repeating something I've heard from somebody who may not know better? And usually that's somebody who looks like me. Somebody with gray hair and this color skin and this gender identification. So that's usually a good tell that if your information network is 50-something white dudes, you're probably in a situation in which you are risking drawing a conclusion without the right information. So I learned very quickly at that point that you've got to go seek out what that information is. The second piece I learned, which I knew, and I just didn't understand how it worked for Amazon, is that Amazon talks about their flywheel. We had a framework we used at Kantar for years, which we called the Right to Grow framework, which is basically a framework, a flywheel that ties together three parts of a retailer's enterprise, which are their economic model, their brand proposition, and their operating model. And finance brand operations or economics brand operations, when you can see how those three things interrelate and connect, you've got something that works. If you can't, you don't. And that's sort of the tell that I've been able to use over the years to varying degrees of success to look at something like Instacart, right? Which people said wasn't going to work. That always seemed insane to me. And Instacart had a brilliant brand to consumers, a ridiculously complicated operating model that they were able to work, but most importantly, an economic model where they could charge for it. People will pay for what Instacart does. And that was always the thing that people seem to be missing, because I think in the software world, everybody's always looking for scalable, right? And anything that looks like it will get in the way of 100% of the population using something gets coded by people that know tech as non-scalable. That's just stupid, to be honest. 20% of the US population is the 12th largest economy in the world, maybe. 20% of the high income US population is probably the 6th largest purchasing entity in the world. So that's all you need. The US is a big place. You don't need everybody to like something. And provided it's well established and understood, you can see that. The retail business that teaches you this as you learn it, which I grew up doing, because my first job back in the MVI days was in 1997. I was running our Costco analysis, and I was also starting our research on chain drug. So when Dan would come in and point to me sitting in our kitchen, which is where my office was, and say, "This is Bryan. He does clubs and drugs." All our interns are like, "I want to work with him."
This guy.
No, not those types of clubs and not those types of drugs. But if you look at Costco and just the remarkable simplicity of their operating model, The
Yeah.
remarkable simplicity of their brand proposition and the remarkable simplicity of their economic model, which all interconnect. That's why Costco continues to be one of the fastest growing retailers in the world and
Uh,
has for the entirety of the 26 years I've been doing this. It's the integration of the model. Where you find things that don't work is when one of those things is just ludicrous or when they don't connect very well. Those are your two blocking points.
so brand, op,
Finance, brand,
finance,
operations.
and operations. And when you
Yeah.
see those three together,
Yeah, when you can build a flywheel out of those three, we can see how they're self-reinforcing. That's a business that's got a chance to grow. If one of them just makes absolutely no sense within the context of the other two and makes no sense in the context of the world, that's usually where you run into trouble. That's a lot of what Q-commerce did. Like Quick Commerce, they had really cool brands and they could figure out how to do it. They just didn't have an economic model that made any sense and never it was never going to. So
and if we pivot over to the brand side now, you've got established brands and you've got emerging brands. Are there some similar things to look for or economic indicators, or
I,
how do
I
we think about the brand side?
I do. I think that framework, it's interesting because brands tend to be a much higher margin space. So it's way more forgiving
Mm,
of lumpy economic models to start with. And there's kind of a wider range of operating models that can work.
mm,
Um, I tend to think about brands a little bit more within the context of how do they overcome some of the challenges within each of those buckets, right? So from an economics point of view, how do they overcome the challenge of nimble competitors who have different economic models than they do?
mm.
And sometimes those nimble competitors that have different economics models than they do are retailers.
Yeah.
And that's both an economics issue and an operations issue, right? So if the business is faster and their economics are different, can I construct a value proposition that within the context of my economic model, my operating model, that competes with that effectively? Um, and then from a branding point of view, is for large brands, it's how do I find any advantage at all in being bigger than a small brand, right?
Mm,
And that at some basic level is what are the economies of scale in branding? How do I use them? And I think one of the great disruptions of the 21st century has been the interruption of traditional scale economics and branding because basically the world's largest advertising platform is basically bought one biddable auction at a time, which is Google, right? So you don't really get an enormous advantage on Google from buying a $500 million a year worth of Google advertising. You still have to buy it one auction at a time, more or
okay.
less, right? So you get better at that. And theoretically, you should be able to learn how to do that more effectively than somebody who doesn't do it as often. It just took brands a long time to get to that point and realize that their economies of scale weren't going to be about buying power. It's going to be about knowledge power. And that transition is difficult. And then for small brands, I think the journey for them is always about, is there a pathway to meaningful scale? I think it's way easier to start a brand and get something that works for a very small group that may not work for a large group.
Mm,
It's kind of the difference between quantum mechanics and actual mechanics. Like if you tried to build the Brooklyn Bridge using principles of quantum mechanics, it would fall down. There's a time where you cross over from the world of the very small to the world of the very large. And the world of the very large just has different rules. And you're going to need to be able to master some of those a little bit in order to be able to make the leap. So, but yeah, I think that largely, since I spend most of my world and time worrying about large companies,
yeah.
it's how do they find what their advantages are in this new ecosystem and find a way to leverage those advantages most effectively.
And maybe not naming names, but who's doing that well, and what are they doing?
I'll give you the one I always use, which so I would name a name, but I name them all the time when I talk about this stuff. But I'm looking at a large company that seems to understand the digital ecosystem best on the brand side. It's L'Oreal. And the funny thing is, you tell L'Oreal that they'll laugh at you, which is one of the reasons why they're so good at this because they think they think they think they're not as good at it as I do. And that's good. There's something to the relatively chaotic rhythms of the fashion industry that have cascaded into L'Oreal's business that actually lend themselves quite well to this world, which is more adaptive, less systemic, more long term, less long term rather, and more short term,
Mm,
more dynamic and less planned, and more diverse and less concentrated. So if I think about all those sort of attributes and stuff like that, that's kind of the beauty business. And L'Oreal is excellent at the beauty business. So they are excellent at those things. Those things then translate reasonably well to a digital ecosystem, which forces you to behave a little bit more that way than the brick and mortar or analog ecosystem does. The other advantage that L'Oreal has, and I know we'll talk about retail media at some point during this, is that L'Oreal has, for the entirety of the time I've been doing this, always thought about retail as a media channel. You know, go into any store anywhere in the world, the imagery, the iconography, the communication that L'Oreal's used at shelf is ridiculously consistent with how they present themselves on television or how they present themselves in magazines. And I think part of that is also that coming out of the beauty business, they're used to using still imagery as a branding device in a way that other companies aren't necessarily good at, which is a skill that until recently was essential for branding yourself in store. You know, if you didn't have a screen there, you could be the best television advertiser in the world, but there's no TV at the shelf, or there didn't used to be.
Yeah.
So I need skills in using static imagery to create brand recognition. L'Oreal's just really good at that. So that translated very well to the medium of retail in some interesting ways. So yeah, I think the nimbleness of being kind of a fashion company at heart, I think creates a different dynamic for them than for other brands that make more money selling the same things over and over again and less money. And the other big piece of this is innovation. I mean, one of the most important things I've ever heard in this industry was at Cannes, and it was 2018. And it was Lubomira Roche, who at the time was the chief digital officer for L'Oreal. And she was talking about their acquisition of Modaface, which is that's one of those first apps that let you try on makeup virtually. And she talked about that we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on consumer and product R&D every year. We've never spent a cent on user experience research and development. This is our investment in user experience R&D. The ability for a company to think about its economic model in such a way that they could realize that the spend they were making to get better at digital should be thought about more like an R&D expense or a CapEx than an operating expense, because it's building an asset for long-term value. That's a really important skill. So when I look at a brand's economic model, to go back to that framework we talked about earlier, the ability to look at your own economics and understand how to allocate resources within your own ecosystem in a way that works for building the competencies that you need, but is explicable to your shareholders, is really important. And L'Oreal does that well. I think the other business that does a good job of that specifically, and that's largely driven by the former CEO ingenuity, is Pepsi. So I think Pepsi does a remarkably good job of basically telling its investors what it's spending money on and why. And if it's not directly accretive to this quarter's P&L, you know, I've heard Indra say the phrase, we're de-risking the business over and over and over again as a way to justify investments that are not short-term P&L accretive. And whether that's D&I, whether that's sustainability, or whether that's e-commerce, that's the way Pepsi tends to look at those investments. They're like, look, this isn't just about returns. You know, you're looking for a risk-adjusted return. And if we're generating too much return and not accounting for the risk that's created in this world, we're lying to you, basically. And I think that's a different tangent, but that takes you down. One of the big learnings, I think, of the 2020 so far from a supply chain point of view is the degree to which risk management was basically an illusion, and that there was no risk management in supply chain, and COVID really exposed that for what it was.
And as you know, we've had such a great experience working with people at PepsiCo. It's been a great.
I thought you would be. I thought you would be in touch with that emotion. So
exactly. Now, for other companies that want to pick up a little bit of that nimbleness and agility, but they're not in the fashion industry, how can they bring some of that in? It sounds like maybe a little bit of chaos may not be the worst thing.
Well, yes, I think that's part of it. And people always say you have to learn to tolerate failure, blah, 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 small part.
Yeah.
Some of that's true, but I think the essence of it is that the biggest problem brands have when I look at the e-commerce space is a simple and obvious one. It's speed. They're just not wired to do the types of things e-commerce asks you to do fast enough. Now, large brands can do things quite quickly. It takes Kellogg's a tenth of a second to make a box of Frosted Flakes, right? I mean,
Right.
they're good at deploying speed in some areas, but they're good at speed when the process is repetitive.
Ah,
When the process is non-repetitive, speed is hard. And
yeah.
what that usually means is that my workflows are too clunky and broken to allow the thing that needs to happen efficiently and quickly.
Hmm.
So I would say that the attribute isn't speed is an outcome of a certain type of behavior. I think tolerance for failure and experimentation are attributes of it. But I think the specific thing is the ability to rewire work so that it can get done in a way that makes sense to your company, but also reflects the needs of the marketplace at the same time. And I think the companies I've seen that are generally best at e-commerce on the branding side are the ones that are most thoughtful about how you can rewire work, how you can rewire KPIs, and think about how KPIs need to be tweaked or aligned. And then the other thing is skills. How do I teach people what they need to know, right? So I need to teach people what they need to know. And then workflow is all about making sure that the decisions that need to be made are run parallel to the information that's provided. There's so many times where somebody's forced to make a decision and then the information comes that they needed to make the decision like a month later or 3 weeks
Yeah.
later or something like that.
Yeah.
The ability to synchronize when this, and often that's not a factor of the data, it's a factor of the workflow. Like the data's there, there's just no process for getting that data out of the ecosystem and into the decision maker's hands in a timely way. Rewiring that is sometimes a tools issue and sometimes a workflow issue. So how do I think about how do I rewire things to allow
Ah,
people that need to make decisions have the information they need to make the decisions when they need to make them. So
rewiring work. I like this one.
yeah. So if only we knew a platform that allowed you to rewire the work of creating digital advertising
Well, we may
quickly and
be able
easily.
to help. We may be able to help there, but before I touch on that, I did want to touch on retail media.
Yeah.
Obviously, one of the hot topics of the last, call it year, 2 years, and certainly the next few years. What should we be thinking about there?
Well, a lot of things, I suppose. I think primarily three or four. Number one is that, retail media is still more or less in its infancy, right? So there's a lot of growing that's going to need to happen in that space. Two, retail media and being good at Amazon are not the same thing because Amazon is a very specific type of retailer that runs retail media a very specific way. It is not the way I think that other retailers are going to need to run that. Again, though, there are attributes of what Amazon does that are important. Reducing friction for the buyer, having a marketing cloud that allows you to do clean room targeting of audiences. I mean, there's some things Amazon does that are really important. But for all that, we were doing a presentation at a large retailer, and they asked me what my parting wisdom was to them or whatever. And I said, y'all got to stop trying to be the second best Amazon in America, right? Like you got to figure out what's unique about a primarily brick and mortar retail media offer that is supplemented with e-commerce. How do you bring those things together to make it way more powerful than what Amazon's able to do on its own with its, largely digital and fairly broken brick and mortar business. So how does that work, right? Like, how do you bring that together? How do you make something meaningful out of that? And I think right now Amazon announced that they're going to start really revamping now their approach to physical retail and to food retail and to grocery delivery and pieces like that. So
Right.
and they're applying themselves to some of the right problems in that too. So let's call it you got a window now to figure this stuff out before Amazon starts to get way better at this stuff.
Hmm.
So let's use that window and really establish what omni-channel retail media looks like. So,
Yeah.
you know, and again, you'll find that I tend to think in threes as the finance brand operations thing. When I think
Yeah.
about the evolution of retail media, people always talk about it bringing together retail and media, but I think the third variable near and dear to your heart is content. So, and I think you taught me this more than anybody else. With retail, media, and content converging at an e-commerce level today, most Amazon teams at most big companies can do that for the most part.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
a bunch of tools like PackView and stuff like that. And there's a bunch of smart people that help you navigate that. The connection between pure play e-commerce retail and specifically Amazon, the media required to manage your Amazon business, which is sometimes media and sometimes what we would call merchandising in the brick and mortar world,
Yeah.
and the content required to bring e-commerce to life. That you can do. So that's level one of the confluence that Confluencer Commerce is based on. Level two, if you can imagine, is now omni-channel retail, not just digital. All of your digital media, not just commerce related media. And then what I like to call the current assets of content. And this is where this is in your world, a lot of the video assets that people
Yeah.
have, user generated content, ratings and reviews, all things that are important, but that aren't like your PMS codes or your brand iconography or things that are meant to last for multiple years. They're current assets. They're on the balance sheet. They're an asset, but they're
Yeah.
not going to be there next year. So how do we manage the current assets, my digital media and the omni-channel world? How do we start to bring those together? Like, how does TikTok commerce work? I mean, until brands and retailers figure this out, Amazon is right now dominating commerce on TikTok. So, and there's no real reason for that. They just nobody else did. So Amazon got smart about it, and what they have like 400 million different mentions of Prime Day on TikTok during Prime Day. So yeah, I think there's an enormous amount there, and then that third level of convergence where you get to the stores, you get to analog media, and you get to sort of what I would call more traditional content. That's a whole different kettle of fish about how you bring all that together. But right now, I think that omni-channel, that level 2.0 confluence between omni-channel digital media and the current assets of content, that's where a lot of the work is going to be from a retail media point of view, is sorting out how to make that work, how do you bring that to life, and where that goes. I think there's a lot of talk, especially in the media world today, about how the retail media networks are difficult and they're different from each other and they don't have standards. And
Yeah.
we need a standard so we can buy it. All we'll get there at some point, right? Like that's a journey. It's fine. It'll take 6 months or 24. It's whether it takes 6 or 24 won't matter in 10 years. Like it just won't.
Yeah.
So and you'll get to a point where most of the large retailers in the world operate on one standard. Amazon operates on another, and Flotsam and Jetsam operates in their own, right? So that'll all sort itself out. I think some of the measurement issues will probably sort themselves out a little bit as well. The other big piece for retail media with me, though, is Kara Pratt on the CPG guys made the point of really reinforcing, because look, retail media isn't retail media. It's just media.
Just media.
And there were two things Kara said in that I thought were brilliant. Well, there are many things, but two that stood out. One is she described like a fraction, if you will, about how to think about what you're trying to accomplish from a retail media point of view, which is inspiration divided by friction. So the if ratio, as I called it for. So if you take inspiration, the amount of inspiration you're able to generate with your media, divide that by the amount of friction it generates, the higher that ratio is, the better your retail media work is. And the multiplier for that is what she called personalization science. So the ability to take what you know about the shopper and give them more inspiration for less friction because you know what you're doing. And I thought that was just the clearest articulation of what personalization is supposed to do in the marketing world I'd ever heard, which I really like. So I think that's definitely one attribute. The second one that I think is fascinating is that you've got two sort of interesting but incomplete assets in the media world. So the metaphor I would use is that they're Rick Moranis and Sigourney Weaver in Ghostbusters, right? They're the key master and the gatekeeper. So you've got retail media running around like Rick Moranis looking for something, and then you've got connected TV floating 3 feet above its bed like Sigourney Weaver. If you can bring those two things together, connected TV and the ability to, at a personal level, understand what people are watching, cross that with retail media and understand what they're buying, my prediction would be is that by 2030, connected TV and retail media, there's a big chunk of that, they're going to be seen as the same thing. They'll be seen as basically connected media or connected full funnel marketing or transparent full funnel marketing. There'll be some catchy buzzword that somebody smarter than me will come up with. That'll be the largest advertising platform in the world, it'll be larger than search. So, because it's too easy. It's too much better than what exists now. Like it doesn't exist now. Retail media's got some issues attached to it. Connected TV has more, to be honest. From a media buying point of view, it's a pretty broken ecosystem for whatever reason. But once those get reconciled and you find a way to use one to leverage the other, that will be the largest advertising platform on earth. So,
well, Bryan, I want to have you come back for another session, but
I don't think we answered any of the questions you wanted to ask, but
that's all right. We got started. But before I let you go here, I wanted to wrap up with a couple personal questions. One is, outside of work, what do you like to do? What's your favorite hobby?
Do a fair amount of travel, do a fair amount of even even outside of work. Although at the moment I don't want to go anywhere when I'm not working. I bike a lot. That's my sort of stress relief. And I've been experimenting with a bunch of new things in 2023 because I got my hip replaced at the beginning of the year. So there's a lot of things I couldn't do before that I can now. So my relaxation at the moment is experimenting with things I wasn't able to do for the last 4 or 5 years. So that's ranged everything from rock climbing to pickleball. So
I love it. That's inspiring. That's the way to do it.
Yeah.
And my other question for you, which is if you were to pick two people that you've learned the most from, who would they be?
This one's hard. One of them is easy, and it's a person I've never met. And the answer, I'm probably going to go with two people I've never met. One of whom is Bill James, the baseball writer.
Right.
For those of you that have ever seen the movie Moneyball, all the math in that movie is Bill James. So, and as a huge baseball fan, when that whole model around using numbers to explain the real world, i.e., baseball, grew up, I was hugely into that. And one of my colleagues actually, when people would start working for me on our research team, they'd say, "What retail books should we get?" And my friend Phil was always like, "You don't need a retail book. Just go read this Bill James book. You'll understand way more about how Bryan thinks reading this than reading anything about retail." It's the ability to use short, sharp, sometimes humorous communication and deep quantitative understanding to illustrate the real world in a variety of ways. And the ability to move back and forth between the quantitative world and the real world as you interpret things, I think is so important from a retail point of view. So, I mean, I've learned that a lot of the way I think about stuff is directly attributable to that. I've had a bunch of professors that were really influential on the way that I think and the way that I learn, and obviously about 100 clients, but I can't really pick one out more than the other. So the second is, I'm going to go with Dale Carnegie. When I was 13 years old, so come as a surprise, I was almost paralyzingly shy as a kid, like wouldn't talk to anybody. And I was almost put in special ed a few times because I was so introverted that the teachers just thought I had a learning disability. And by the time I was 13, I realized that if I was ever going to get a date, I was going to have to talk to people. So I was browsing my parents' bookshelf and I found this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And I read the book and I don't really remember much about the book, although I do. It was really interesting and useful. But the thing on the back cover that struck me about it was it said it was the second best-selling book of all time after the Bible. And for the first time at the age of 13, it occurred to me that I wasn't the only one with that problem. And to this day, as some of my dear friends know, I still struggle with that. I'll tell somebody about a problem. Oh, God, I got this issue. They're like, "Yeah, everybody has it." I'm like, "Oh, I want to, but I want to be a rare flower. Why can't it just be my problem?" But the learning that oftentimes, if you're staring at something, everybody else is too, allows you to communicate with confidence when you don't know things. That ability to do that, which sometimes comes off as annoying mansplaining, but the ability to have a conversation where you don't know things because you've got enough confidence to realize that if you don't know it, other people may not know it too, rather than you're the idiot and everyone else knows what's going on. If you just approach a conversation like that with an open spirit of chaotic curiosity, there's just no limit to what you can learn. And that's not what the back cover of that book said, but that's over the years as I have embedded that idea into how I think about stuff. That might be the most important thing I've ever learned. So I'll tip the cap to Dale Carnegie.
What a great insight. I love that. That's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
Well, Bryan, always a pleasure. We're excited to see more of you on the CPG guys and at some upcoming events. And thank you so much for taking some time out to talk with me today.
Always pleasure, Dave. Look forward to doing it again.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard, please visit our website at itsrapid.ai, where you can find out more about creating e-commerce content and digital media at scale. And remember to subscribe to hear more great episodes of Beyond the Shelf. See you next time.